We've been talking about education dollars, in fact, for decades, ever since I've been involved in public education in Texas. And you might say there are several aspects of this. One is the money evenly and fairly distributed? Another is there enough money? But a third question, which is the question we're going to focus on, is how is the money spent? How can you get more bang for the buck? And so we're going to have a good time talking about that. We have a very distinguished group here, and I'm going to ask each one to briefly introduce him or herself.
I'm Margo from El Paso, Texas. I'm a former CEO and a former member of the Texas House of Representatives. I've been involved peripherally as a CEO with education because I think the economic viability of a community is solely predicated on the education of its workforce. And that's been important, and we're lagging in the El Paso region. But I think I'm up here because I spent 2 years, I lost my reelection in 2012, and Michael Williams, who I think's left, hasn't he?
Yes.
Came to me and knew I was vulnerable and talked me into serving on the Board of Managers for the El Paso Independent School District. In August of 2012, our superintendent did his perp walk before jail. He went to prison for corruption and credit manipulation, very analogous to what was going on in Atlanta, almost identical. So in December of 2012, Michael Williams, our commissioner, determined to disband the trustees at the El Paso Independent School District, which, by the way, is the 10th largest school district in Texas, 60,000 students, 9,000 employees, and a budget of around $480 million, not counting bond debt. But so he put together 5 of us, a monitor who was already there, and 4 of us to replace the trustees. The former trustees filed a suit with the Department of Justice and the TEA to stop this. So we were delayed to be sworn in until May of 2013. So we walked in 2013 with a former superintendent in jail, an interim superintendent, an FBI investigation, and a complete revamping of the entire district at hand. It was an interesting timeline. It was really, I say, analogous to a $500 million turnaround from a corporate standpoint. We had to undo and redo everything, starting with finding a new superintendent and going through the budget. But I'll stop there and address some of the other issues that we dealt with as we discuss on our panel.
My name is Culwell, and I was a superintendent, public school superintendent in Texas for 23 years. My last superintendency was in the Garland Independent School District, the east side of Dallas County, second largest school district in Dallas County. District then of almost 60,000 students. It was also, has the longest running intra-district public school choice program in the United States. It was part of a desegregation plan many years ago, which the district had no boundaries within for parents for neighborhood schools, and everyone got a choice of the schools. It was interesting. It has been a long-running, interesting project with many positive outcomes, and it's also one that is fraught with a lot of complexity as well. In the time that I was a superintendent, I was also superintendent of the Lubbock Independent School District. I had the good fortune or bad fortune of following Mike Moses when then Governor Bush appointed him Commissioner of Education. And I've worked in other districts, large and small, and across the state. My interest, again, in what I do now, it goes back to what some of my interest has been on the financial side and some of the things that Dee talked about in his experiences. I've always been interested in human capital, the development of human capital, how public schools relate to that, what public schools in Texas do in relationship, not only of producing quality students for post-secondary readiness and workforce readiness, but how they compare from district to district, from state to state, and then again from nation to nation, and looking at what we do from an international aspect in this global world we live in. So All that has brought me to a post-superintendent career as I work with Moat Casey and Associates, school finance experts here in Austin. We also have an accountability and assessment division as well. And we work with multiple school districts and multiple policy groups across the state, as well across the United States and in a number of different areas. And excited about being here and being such august presence of Don McAdams, Margo, and soon to be introduced Dr. Lori Taylor.
Great. Well, that's a wonderful entree. My name's Lori Taylor. I'm a member of the faculty at the Bush School of Government and Public Service over at Texas A&M. And I have been serving as a researcher on behalf of the state of Texas and as a scholar publishing quite a body of work looking at school district productivity, educational sector productivity. One of my particular areas of emphasis is thinking about regional differences in the cost of education, because if you want to talk about educational productivity, you have to recognize that the educational dollar doesn't stretch quite as far in some parts of the state as it does in others, that school districts in the greater Houston metropolitan area have to pay a higher wage to attract the same caliber of individual as could be attracted in a location with a lower cost of living. And that if you don't take those differences into account, you'll get misleading ideas about what is an effective and efficient school district and what is not. I'm also believe that I'm here on the panel because of my role in helping to develop the financial accountability study for Texas, or the FAST, which is in the process of being morphed into the Texas Smart Schools Initiative. Susan Combs is taking the FAST project to taking it private to a nonprofit organization, and I've been the principal investigator on helping to make that transition. We're scheduled to launch next week with a data engine that allows schools and districts to compare themselves to others, not only with respect to the value added by those school districts, so demographically adjusted for prior performance of students, but also with respect to the financial resources that are being brought to bear in that school district, which is a way of really getting at this deep question of productivity. We do a lot to help school districts identify high-performing exemplars and ask them to emulate that, but we need to do more to help schools and districts identify cost-effective peers, because if you can't be cost-effective, you're not getting as much done for the children of Texas as you could be.
And I'm Don McAdams, and I served 12 years on the Houston Independent School District Board, and for 10 years founded and ran a not-for-profit that provided school board training to urban school districts, mostly outside of the state of Texas, but many school districts in Texas. And in fact, I had the privilege to work with Curtis and his board, some in Garland years ago. I think the reason why Jim and Courtney asked me to chair this panel is because for about 10 years I made my living as a productivity and quality management consultant. And I had clients nationally and internationally in mining, finance, travel, manufacturing, paper mills, all kinds of things. And so that background in productivity and quality management led me to, I think, some encouragement from Jim and Charles Miller, who some of you know, to write a paper on productivity and quality improvement for Texas public education. And that paper is now dated. I think it was 2012, but it's posted on the TIER website if anyone wants to check it out. So with that background, I come to this panel. And I think our job is really to talk about what is going on in Texas to improve productivity and what we need to do to make it possible to really accelerate those improvements in productivity. Because how you spend the money is very important. You all will recall that a core statement in the Texas Constitution, which has driven a lot of the legal activity around this, calls for a system of efficient free public schools. And efficient certainly means many things. It means fair, I think. The courts have ruled that. It means adequate, and it also means at the lowest possible cost. That is, the taxpayers actually expect us to do the best job we can, but they don't expect us to spend more money than we need to do a good job. One of the things you learn about life is that resources are always scarce. No matter how much you have, you wish you had more. And the proof of that, by the way, is that the richest, most powerful wealth in the entire history of the world is the United States federal government. And it's currently $19 trillion in debt, running huge annual deficits. There's not enough money even for the United States. So there's never enough money for educators. We always want more. And we will always feel like we don't have enough. But the big question for us is, how do we spend the money wisely? So I'd like to just first lay out a sort of a primer on productivity, and then open it up to the panel, and we're going to have a rich discussion about this. I think productivity, as most of you know, is output divided by input. And of course, that's more complicated than it sounds, because you have to define the output very carefully. And the more you want to drive productivity improvements, you've got to get output at a very fine grain. You also have to link output with input, which means you need to know the cost of everything you do. And that means the kind of financial reporting which is comprehensive and transparent and can link the cost of the inputs to the outputs. And so it sounds simple conceptually, but it's actually quite difficult to do. But actual productivity improvement is innovation. These are the tools, measuring outputs, measuring inputs, process analysis, process control, collecting data about the process. But it's actually innovation which makes the change. And Rod Page said something I thought was very interesting last night, and I've heard him say this before, and that is, if we're going to improve the performance of our schools, the people who are going to make those improvements are going to be the people that are in the schools. And that is another clear principle of productivity improvement, is that the people doing the work are the ones that have the best ideas of how to innovate. So there is a big role, even though innovation may take place at the school site and in the district, there's a big role for the state in terms of creating an environment in which that innovation can take place. So now let me ask the panel, and we'll get into a fairly informal discussion here about what you have observed about actual attempts to improve productivity in the state, things you may have done also in your work, and what you think are some of the things we need to do to create a framework where productivity improvement, where innovation is actually more easily accomplished in our school districts.
Let me just start, if I may, from a superintendent's perspective, former superintendent's perspective. Again, working with many school districts across the state, looking at clearly defined objectives of a district, and when you talk about outputs, being able to determine what those outputs are, and giving some thought, of course, to the available resources that are going to be the inputs. And, but also understanding is, with my experience, and I think Dr. Taylor has more experience in this and looking at it analytically, there are geographical differences in the cost of education, from large district and urban districts to rural East Texas districts, or sparsity in far West Texas, and which always has an impact on some of your expenditures. And thus, when you look at what expenditures are, and certain expenditures most of the time be broken out by per child or some particular function. For example, El Paso or Lubbock, in our expenditures, are going to have higher transportation costs in many ways, because we have to cover a lot of terrain and a lot of territory. Whereas in the urban areas, transportation may also have a significant cost if you're running, for example, a choice district, or you're trying to respond to possibly a desegregation plan where you have a high degree of transportation. So there are a lot of different factors, that geographical factors, that impact what you do from a budgetary standpoint. But the most significant is, because in your experience and Dee's experience, as well as Dr. Taylor's research, of course, is your most largest budget expenditure is personnel. That, salaries and benefits take up the most of your budget. Different percentages in different districts. So when you begin to look at what your outputs are going to be, and then you look at what your inputs, the human capital business in education, about hiring and being able to have good people and be able to look at that cost and be able to analyze that cost, not only on geographical differences, because that does has an impact, but also drill down to the cost in an individual classroom with an individual teacher and individual productivity. And those are things that as you put budgets together, the conversations have to take place, in which Dee certainly can talk about it, and you, in an environment where you have publicly elected officials that are making that decision, helping you make that decision, then efficiencies sometimes become somewhat complicated.
So you're suggesting that maybe the politicians sometimes make things less efficient than we would like them to be.
I don't think a trustee considers himself a politician, although their actions would belie that. One thing, I was on appropriations in the legislature in 2011, that's the 82nd session, when we had a reduction in revenues and made significant cuts. And as we were making the analysis on appropriations of what the school districts looks like, it was ironic that when we looked at the fund balances, the reserves of the respective districts, the rural districts had the largest fund balances across the state, which is their, as I say, their reserve. Which somebody would think would be atypical or the opposite of what would normally be the case. But the funding was, it was really kind of interesting that the rural districts had a higher fund reserve as a percentage and as a dollar amount typically than the larger districts.
And I have a theory, which is that the state of Texas hasn't updated its regional cost of education index since it was first adopted in 1991. And the cost of living has been going up throughout the state, but it's been growing up really fast in Austin, in San Antonio, in most of our urban areas, much faster than it has in our rural areas. And our failure to recognize this has put greater financial pressure on our urban districts than on our rural districts, comparatively speaking. And that puts the rural districts in a better position to put something away for a rainy day than the urban districts are able to do.
The funding distortion is there. We got into the El Paso budget right after, when we were sworn in May of 2013. We immediately had to pass a budget, find a superintendent. We were also in the midst of an FBI investigation, which was to a certain extent still going on. But the budget we passed in 2013 for the 13-14 year was predicated on what the former trustees had put down and their former leadership within the district. And what we found out is the following year we had a $15 million, actually close to $20 million deficit because they had improperly determined the number of students from a demographic standpoint. Actually, our demographer was correct, but for some reason the former CFO chose to use his own numbers, and they were padding them. And so we had to make decisions in the 14 budget that were pretty significant, yet we did it without layoffs and we did it without other things, which pointed out, from my standpoint, the inefficiencies that we've got throughout. We did a facilities audit, we did a curriculum and instruction audit, we revamped the internal auditor. One of the problems with the corruption was that the former trustees had allowed the internal auditor to report to the superintendent and not to them, which is a violation of their fiduciary responsibilities. And as a result, the internal audit that showed credit manipulation was kept in the superintendent's office, stamped draft, until it finally surfaced with the FBI and investigations. But we revamped everything. The facilities audit showed we had a third more schools than we need. The curriculum and instruction audit was redone. Policies and procedures were redone. We did everything. It was a complete turnaround. And that was what was kind of interesting about it. You got to see the nuts and the bolts from the other side all the way up. And we tried to we compressed the steps for teachers and compensation, and did a lot of things that no one else had done, and tried to upgrade the facilities investments. They had a lot of deferred maintenance, all these things. None of these decisions were being made, frankly, from my standpoint, not just because the trustees lacked their governance oversight, but because they weren't qualified to do that. They really didn't know how to do it. And that's an issue, I think, that's across the state, not just El Paso, but is across the state on the trustees. First of all, that's where all the money is. the aggregation of the school budgets in El Paso County, see, when you take all the districts of $1.4 billion of state, federal, and local tax dollars, the El Paso Independent School District budget was greater than the county budget, greater than the county hospital budget, and greater than the city budget when you took away what I call non-governmental functions like the bus system and our airport and bridges and garbage collection, things like that. But people don't grasp the size of it. And we're electing people to fulfill a fiduciary role in the oversight of those dollars, for which too many of them are not equipped to do that.
Governance, school governance, and I'd be interested in hearing Don's comments too, because his years as a trustee and also doing board training, which in my new role I do board training as well, and something working with boards. And there's such a wide variance in sophistications from boards to boards. I worked in a rural school district that everyone was a college graduate, and there were 2 PhDs on the board. Very, very smart, people in terms of their fiscal responsibility, as well as what the instructional goals and role of the district was. But you do have a wide variance, and just like you have a wide variance of access to wealth in this district, because in this state, because we are such a large state, and we are a state that is a property tax state, ad valorem tax state. We don't have a state income tax, so we have so many variations in terms of wealth and access to wealth, where certain school districts have much easier decisions to make in terms of the economics of what they do, and other districts have a much more difficult decisions to make. But the complexities of school budgeting and being able to understand what the school finance system does and how it impacts, while that's one layer, the other layer is, again, just having an understanding of the budgeting process that private sector and business persons, men or women, know and understand. And again, labor cost, the salaries and the benefits, and going over to the benefit side, which is a tremendous problem for a lot of districts, as Dee shakes his head knows from his time in El Paso, but many districts with the state of flux that healthcare is in this country, that is a driving cost that also sometimes is a deterrent to high degrees of efficiency in any institution, particularly public institutions. But the governance issue, again, making decisions that are not primarily driven by democratic localism, which, you know, governance and democracy, we're all for that. But being able to work with trustees to make sound fiscal decisions that are not only sound, but also, again, the training standpoint, Don, about efficiencies that can be measured, about productivity models that can that are out there, because it is not a field that there's not excellent research and excellent models to follow.
Right. Well, let me say that, and picking up on both of these comments, I've had a chance to work with over 100 school board superintendent teams in districts all over the United States. And I have found very few boards who understand and actively carry out their responsibility for oversight. Oversight is a huge, major responsibility for governance. It's one of the big two. I'll mention the other one in a minute. And it requires a system. It requires discipline on the part of the board. I was lucky on the Houston board for 12 years. We never had any big financial problems, but we were lucky. We had real good management. And they were honest and working hard, and they were being looked at by the state and auditors and so forth. But the board was not doing its job with oversight at all. We were just sort of lucky. I've worked with many districts where the board hasn't been lucky, but I've worked with very few where the board has any kind of a systematic approach to oversight. They don't know what the word means. Some of them think it means gotcha. It means oversight by anecdote, going around schools in the afternoon and seeing if they can find something wrong, asking people, asking teachers, what are you unhappy about? They think that's oversight by anecdote, you know. They don't understand systematic oversight. And, I had the naive assumption you could train boards how to do that, and they would then do it. But I discovered that some of them just either don't want to or are too lazy or they're obsessed with other things that are more important for them. So that's one thing. I mean, the current system we have, and I suspect this is true throughout the state of Texas, that very few boards are really doing a good job of oversight. And Paige talked about governance last night. I think we need to limit boards to what they can do and then make sure they're the right people and the right skills to really do those things very well, and one of those is oversight. Now, on the issue, Curtis, about how the boards get involved in spending money, one of the big drivers for inefficiency in urban school districts is underutilized schools. Have you ever tried to close a school? Any school board members here ever tried to close a school? Is it easy or hard? Now, this is what the people want, right? You're elected representative, and this is what the people want. If you look at urban America generally, most every big urban district has anywhere from 20 to 30% redundancy in the number of schools. They don't need to just close 2 or 3. They need to close 30 or 40. And the reason places like Philadelphia and St. Louis and Kansas City and districts all over the country, urban districts, have these high per pupil costs is because they have way too many schools, but try to close them. So there's a political reason why, I know they don't call themselves politicians, they're trustees, but there's a political reason why school districts maybe aren't as efficiently run as they could be. I don't know if you've done any research on that, Lori, on
Well, I have done a number of projects looking at the benefits of consolidation, because there are huge economies of scale in education, and we're not exploiting them everywhere that we could be. And what we've basically found is that there's a trade-off between consolidation and choice. And then when you consolidate if you consolidate too much, you're going to lose the choice that does represent a real incentive to efficiency. But the second thing we found was that if you aren't willing to consolidate the schools, if you aren't willing to close a few schools, consolidating the school districts isn't going to get you very much, because the bang for your buck productivity-wise is in getting to more optimally sized campuses, not necessarily getting to more optimally sized districts.
So you're saying it's not that we have too many school districts necessarily. We might.
We might.
But
we do in some places.
We definitely have too many schools.
But it's definitely the case that we have a lot of inefficiently small schools.
We have too many. Just to give you firsthand, El Paso has 94 schools with an average age of 55 years. Our analysis from the facilities and the prior trustees talking about governance, it's part and parcel, governance and dollars. I mean, you can't have one without the other. They had not done a facilities oversight study in 15 years. I mean, that ought to be an ongoing thing if you know how you're going to fulfill your fiduciary responsibilities. But what it showed when we contracted for that to see what we had and where we were is that we actually have 1/3 more schools than we need. Now, that's a significant dollar drain. That money ought to go going into the classrooms. But I'm telling you, politically, it was a night. In fact, we only had 2 years as a board of managers. They now can have up to 4 years. I would have liked 3. I think to change the culture of an organization, from my own experience, it takes 3 years at a minimum. But we left it for the elected trustees who succeeded us. But trying to point out the schools that ought to be closed and some of the issues related to them, I mean, it was politically very tough. You had people standing out in front, not my school. I went here, my mother went here, and I mean, there's this whole thing. And it just was, but we can't afford not to deal with that if we truly want an education outcome that's commensurate with what we ought to be having.
There's maybe nothing more difficult than closing a school. And we've seen that in reconstitution efforts in other areas across the United States. And, particularly, I don't know what was worse, closing neighborhood elementary school because you were going to tear children away out of the neighborhood and make them, traverse all kinds of dangers to go to another school that's maybe a mile away.
True.
Or closing a high school and all the tradition that's associated with that, and the graduates and all of that. That can be that can take quite a toll. But again, looking at it, I can remember riding around with Chad Willerly when he was superintendent in Dallas, and looking at schools that had been closed up because they had a decline in enrollment in the late 80s, early 90s. And then it wasn't that long later, we were looking at, how were we going to reopen and retool these schools because population had begun to grow. Regentrification, redensification of neighborhoods, changing demographics, that it makes sometimes facilities a very inexact science. Because when you look at some of the neighborhoods in many of our urban areas, they've changed demographically, and all of a sudden they have a lot more kids. I mean, it's not just from an age standpoint, but also some areas are now much more desirable in core urban areas. It's where everybody wants to live. And has Montrose changed any in Houston, Don?
Yeah.
And we can go on and on about areas like that. The other thing that's had an impact is charter school growth on facilities because charter schools have grown. They have more students now, and particularly in Philadelphia, Moody's rating agency had issued a warning, and one of the things they had said is because of the growth of the charter schools in Philadelphia and in the Pennsylvania system predicated much on funding per pupil, how many kids you have. And they'd lost so many kids, they were worried about whether they were going to be able to make their debt payments. And that goes to, again, to some of the things that you talk about. He's being able to look at the long run on facilities and be able to make really good, coherent decisions. And nobody's brought up a $63 million football stadium, so I'm glad about that. But those are areas of again, probably right behind salaries and benefits is facility management.
So y'all, years ago, Diane Ravitch wrote a book called The Schools We Deserve. It's still a good book. And I think it relates to this question. I hesitate to say this because I'm a really big Democrat with a small d. I mean, I really believe in people and voting and, liberty and all that. But I wonder sometimes if we have too much democracy in our schools. I'm not talking about parental choice as customers. I'm talking about the politics at this level. And you see this at every level. And I want to switch the topic a little bit to look at maybe the state's role in too much democracy in the schools, if that's the right way to put it. We've been talking about how maybe school boards don't want to make the tough decisions sometimes. And we've talked earlier about policy. I've sometimes thought maybe the state has too many policies around public education. If you look at Chapter 21, dealing with personnel, this is a highly regulated system. And here we are, we're focusing on productivity on this panel. And if you're in a labor-intensive business, managing your workforce is really the key to your productivity. And again, I'd be interested in some of the comments about the difficulty of managing the workforce and still complying fully with Chapter 21. Now, the legislature, in its wisdom, I should always add that because we have legislators and former legislators in the room. The legislature, in its wisdom, has put all these regulations out here about who can teach and how you hire them and how you evaluate them and how you terminate them and how you pay them and how you do everything you can imagine. This has got to drive inefficiencies at the operational level of school districts.
The demographic characteristics of an effective teacher have been a research area for the profession for decades. And we know that having an effective teacher is hugely important, and Rick Hanishek kind of described some of the huge implications of not having a really effective teacher labor corps. And we also know a couple of other things. We know that the things in a standardized teacher salary schedule, the years of experience and the advanced degrees, don't have a whole heck of a lot of predictive power when it comes to who's really effective in the classroom. And let's face it, we all know PhDs who can't teach their way out of a paper bag. So we all know that having an advanced degree is not the be-all and end-all of being an effective teacher. But we sure spend a lot of money on that. We also know that once you get past the kind of shakedown cruise first few years of being a teacher, each additional year of teaching doesn't add a whole heck of a lot to your classroom effectiveness. But yet we tie salary to that through, in the regulatory context, our minimum salary schedule. And quite frankly, I think that the Texas minimum salary schedule is not binding for most districts, and an irrelevancy that really needs to be removed.
You've got the retention issues for the good teachers, that's the 5 and 10 years, versus the entry level for competition. We're fighting that in the salary levels. One example similar to this on the productivity side, there is too much bureaucracy. One of the things we were trying to do that I wanted to do before we left is we had some examples of moving. The principals to me are the key component for the success of a school. And we don't do a good job, from my perspective, firsthand in El Paso, of training principals in human capital, resource management, identifying talent and coaching talent. They got to identify it and they got to coach it. We also had situations where we took one principal from a lower socioeconomic area school and moved her over to a wealthier area, okay? She'd had over 20 years of a great track record at 2 different elementary schools. We're 80% Hispanic in El Paso, and a lot of those in the lower socioeconomic areas, we would find that the parents enjoyed a principal, liked a principal who was fairly autocratic, wanting to tell them what to do, where to go, what to do, et cetera. And then we moved this particular principal, who had, as I say, a great track record, to a little more higher income level area where parents wanted to participate. She failed miserably. Parents were going nuts. And writing, well, how can you do this? The same success things she did that were successful in this other school were not successful over here. And so point out to me, we're not training them on how to adapt and what to do and identify that. And just like in management and our own organizations, when you want to coach up talent. Politically, some of the people, especially in the Washington area and others, will talk about, we got to get rid of bad teachers, blah, blah, blah. The majority are not bad teachers. There's not enough sharing of what works well in certain, across the board. We found silos galore. Part of the reason we had so many silos at EPISD was because the prior superintendent created such an environment that people were living in fetal positions and just, leave me alone and I'll get through the day. So it's a cultural environment as much as it is spending time and energy and effort on training those principals, taking some of this bureaucracy away from them, the paperwork, the stuff that's required, both federally and statewide, and allow them to spend time in the classrooms more than the 45-minute, one recommended 45-minute observation, minimum 1, recommended 3. I told Michael Williams when he was doing it, I thought that was not nearly enough. I mean, they need to be spending their entire time, for the most part, going around to those classrooms and looking at and seeing what works well and what we can do over here, et cetera, et cetera. And to me, that's the critical key that's not being addressed as far as we observed as a board of managers in El Paso.
So, Curtis, I want you to have the last comment here because we need some time for questions. I've been given the sign that we have about 10 minutes. So if you could respond to the point about the number of employees in school districts. I mean, you hear this criticism, and I've seen the data. We've all seen the data. How the number of adults in the system per pupil have been rising for the last 4 or 5 decades. There's just more and more adults in the system per child. I've never seen superintendents purposely just adding people because they want to. To what extent does the driving upward of all these adults in the system, to what extent is that a response of mandates that come downhill saying we need you to regulate this and this and this and this? And to what extent do you think it's just the people on site wanting more staff to do something?
It's a combination of both. We saw a significant reduction in school employees after the 2011 budget cuts. What we see is a large amount of support staff, and much of the support staff in schools are very low paid. And support staff And many of the districts I worked in are some of the hardest working people, but are some of the lowest paid that there are. A lot of them are working for one thing, and that's to have access to health care benefits. And if they're doing the family, if they're providing for their whole family, then they're probably their whole paycheck is paying for health care benefits. So that is one side of it. The other is there is a tendency to, of course, in any public entity and other governance structure, to layer up, and every new idea begets, more employees. And very few new ideas beget less employees. And the fact that needing to look back instead of expanding and adding a new program, looking at what neutrality are you going to have in your employment process or in the budgetary process. We're going to add something, but we're going to stay budget neutral because something's going to go away. And what is the critical aspect of it? The other thing is being able to look and respond to all the external needs of students beyond education. And is the schoolhouse the place to provide those? Extensive health care, nurses, counselors. Security is a huge increase in the cost of services in public schools. The biggest change in my career. And you have a number of those support services. Are they necessary? I do think they are. But I think you always look at, and I think Houston's going through this, Houston ISD is going to look at a significant budget reduction, and they're looking at how much can they take out of central office staff. Sometimes that's effective, sometimes it's not. But I think that I think that's one of the things that Dr. Taylor has seen in her research time and time is being able to look at non-essential employees. The most important thing is teacher in the classroom. And I would submit sometimes the second most important thing are the trustees that are elected. And I had the privilege of working with great trustees all through my career. Those two things are exceedingly important. And all the things in between sometimes can really have an impact where all the good and all the resources and all the efficiency you desire, sometimes it's difficult to get down there. The last thing I'll say, Don, again, there's a lot said about teacher quality in the panel before and Dr. Hanishak's comments. I can't tell you that we have to make an investment in being able to attract and retaining quality people to go into the teaching profession that are well-trained, that are committed, that have the resources, but also the training to understand what good pedagogy looks like and to be able to continue to grow and not after 5 years, that's it. I learned how to do this and I'm never going to go any further. So those are some things that I think could really increase on the productivity side as well as impact efficiency.
You have a comment on this, Lori, before we go to the questions?
I was just going to point out that it being having more adults per child is symptomatic of having more schools than you need.
Yes.
The two are very closely and intrinsically linked.
Okay, we have time for a few questions. I'm told we need to be right on time to make way for the next session. Any comments or questions from those of you here about productivity? This is a deep subject. We could go into this for a long time. Right up here first.
CFO of a school in New Orleans, and I remember when I was managing the finances there, I thought, gee, I should start a bus company. So one thing that you guys talked about was inefficiencies in transportation, and I'm wondering if it's inefficient because schools shouldn't be managing it? If we had public transportation, because in New Orleans, previously students received tokens to ride public transportation, then Katrina destroyed all of that.
Mm-hmm.
We looked at it at El Paso to make some analysis, and it turned out, from our standpoint as the Board of Managers, the interesting thing was everything was on the table. We were functioning as at-large trustees, given a limited timeline, and so everything could be on the. We weren't subject to an election or anything else. So we looked at that. We had a study done to see if that would do it. It pointed out that it was kind of a wash, so we didn't do it. We talked about consolidation of the cafeteria workers, et cetera, with other districts and everything else. The police forces. When I was in the legislature, I mandated, along with another representative from El Paso, a study on why every district had to have their own little police force. Isn't there a way to do it? Well, they came back and said, no, we all need this and we all that. So But those are all things that ought to be looked at, in addition to what Lori talked about, having fewer districts within counties.
So, Courtney, do we have room for one question, or are we? Quick question, Anna.
I mean, I don't know if there's a quick answer, but I just want to throw it out.
Well, it has to be a quick
So
question
it's on us.
that calls for a quick answer.
So as a trustee who is responsible for reviewing and approving a budget in a district that wins awards all the time for our budgeting and finance, it's an incredibly cryptic reporting system that we have to review our budget by, and I was just wondering if you all have any recommendations of better ways to do that, or if there are other people in the room that would be interested in talking about that. I did meet with one of the assistant commissioners a couple weeks ago, and he said that if we could gather a group of people from across the state, that he would provide a container for that conversation to happen in, because like you said, most of us are lay people that run for these positions. There isn't a crash course in budgeting, budget and finance, and government accounting rules are really cryptic and hard to follow even for people who have expertise and experience in accounting.
So Anna, offline, I need to answer that question because I developed for the board training program that I used to be in charge of a whole half day for the board on its role in the budget process.
Right.
And I'll talk to you about it offline.
Okay.
We broke it down. We forced everybody to come in and give a complete breakdown of every department, all the way down to the nuts and bolts. Went through a series of studies on that. So we had to. We
and
felt
what
we
we
had
find
to.
is we get bits and pieces that people want to share, or politically, easier or more controversial, and it is. I mean, we have a $1.89 billion annual budget on top of a $2 billion bond that we're administering right now, so there's a lot of places to hide in that budget.
And comment?
It strikes me that one of the challenges is, how do you know what's aberrant, what's odd about our budget? And the only way you can know it is to know what's going on in other school districts. And one of the things that Texas does very much have going for it is that we have a lot of information available about the expenditures at the fund, function, and object level for every school district in the state. And we're not making as much use of it as we could or should be. And one of the important things where I'm trying to contribute to the conversation is producing some better metrics on what's being spent.
Well, I want to thank our panel, and thank you all for your attention, and I think we need to make way for the next part of the program.